Good evening, everyone. My name is David Shearer. I'm the Executive Director of Claremont Heritage, and I want to welcome you to our Muriel Faith O'Brien Speaker Series, which is funded by the estate of Miss O'Brien. And we're also celebrating Earth Day today, which is kind of appropriate. Claremont actually had a street tree committee way before it had any kind of formal city government. So there's a real history here that I think we're going to learn a little bit about tonight, which is quite fascinating, actually. I want to encourage you to please visit our website, ClaremontHeritage, all one word, .org, to learn more about how you could be involved with Claremont Heritage and helping to keep Claremont's history alive. There are opportunities for volunteering through estate planning, membership, or even underwriting some of our programs. So I'd like to encourage you to look there and also to see what's coming up. One thing that is happening next month is our annual awards gala on May 22nd, and it will be virtual again this year due to the pandemic. And our awards this year are going to Richard Martinez, who is a artist and teacher. He will receive our Cultural Heritage Award. And then our Best Garner, and Best Garner was, of course, one of the, considered Mrs. Claremont, basically. Our Best Garner Preservation Award will go to the Claremont Wildlands Conservancy, who has been working for many years to preserve our hillsides and keep them free of development for the enjoyment of our community and people from outside our community, which we have many. So that is happening on May 22nd at 7 p.m. Please check out our website and you can find a link there for the gala, annual gala, awards gala. Tonight, I'm very excited to have Ryan Tichenor here to speak about Ralph Cornell. And so just to lay a little bit of the ground rules, Ryan is going to do his presentation, and then you can actually log in to, or you can go to the bottom of your screen and there's a Q&A button. If you have a question, please enter it there. And then at the end of the presentation, I will moderate the questions and we can, try to get find out a little bit more about the history of Ralph Cornell in Claremont and in Southern California. So a little bit about Brian. Brian Tichenor has practiced architecture and landscape architecture in California for more than 35 years. He was a designer in Charles Moore's office, was a partner with Nancy Goslee Power, and a student of architectural history under David Gephard. He and his wife, Raun Thorp, founded Tichenor Thorp Architects in 1990 and have completed over 400 projects around the world. He is currently a professor at USC, where he has taught for the last 12 years, and the work of his firm has been extensively published, including a recent monograph from Vendome Press Outside In, The Houses and Gardens of Tichenor Thorp. I haven't picked it up yet, but I really am interested to see that and look through it. Current projects include many houses and gardens, mostly in California, several large biomedical campuses, and the design of both the buildings and landscape of the new Los Angeles Times headquarters and cultural center. I was just speaking with Brian a little bit earlier, and he mentioned to me that his firm has just been hired to do the landscape design for the Eames House. So that is the case study house, I think number 9, that is become an icon of design in Southern California. So that's exciting. And without further ado, I would like to welcome Brian to our presentation tonight.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for tuning in, I guess is the way to put it in these times. So I'm going to talk about Raun Cornell tonight, who is really one of my favorite characters in the history of Southern California landscape architecture. Let's start with this image, and well, here we are in another drought, and we all love our parks and gardens, maybe now more than ever. They're very hard to keep up, and they take a lot of water. So consider this advice. Now, why not plant parks in such a manner that they will produce maximum results at minimum expenditure? Plant a dry ground park. Use native plants already accustomed to the semi-arid conditions of our soil and climate. Such a park would be at once unique and would be decidedly typical and distinctive of California. It would be a place for those interested to go and see a collection of California plant life in its native environment, where they might study the habits of the individual and see its fullest development under favorable conditions. That's a quote from an article Raun Cornell wrote 109 years ago in the May 1912 Pomona College Journal of Economic Botany. It was titled "Wanted, a Genuine Southern California Park." And it's obviously a pretty relevant piece for today. For a man who spent fully 60 years trying to provide Southern California with the parks he felt the region deserved, it's kind of an amazing place to start. I love to talk about Raun Cornell. He, perhaps more than any other landscape architect in Southern California, gathers up all the threads of the 2 most vital periods of our landscape history and joins them into one astonishing career. As I hope I can convey tonight, this is an incredible career to consider. In my classes, I always like to pose the question, in what way is this important? Here's 3 reasons. Cornell was a pioneering landscape architect whose vast body of work set the stage for the way public landscapes in our region look, creating an aesthetic which was distinct from the slavish imitations of East Coast design that were the norm before his generation. No one else came close to the amount of work he authored. He's a fascinating character in the history of landscape architecture in this country. Looking closely at his career provides an extraordinary insight into both the development of the region and into the long road that was traveled in establishing landscape architecture as a profession. And third, he was responsible for what I feel are 3 of the most highly significant landscape projects in Southern California. And they are distinctly different, which is unusual. Let me go on to the next slide, sorry. He was born in Nebraska in 1890. His father was in the lumber business and he had ranches and lumber yards in the Holridge area and environs. He was a great lover of horses. Cornell bought his first horse at the age of 10 years old. From an early age, he's drawn to what he refers to as the sacred out of doors, where throughout his life he would seek the lonely communion with nature to refresh his soul, his words. Note the dogs on the back of the horse. I don't know why, it just happens. I guess this was a thing. He was of the last generation that was brought up on horseback. He would write in his late life, "The memory of horses tormenting my soul." I think we underestimate the degree to which traveling on horseback connects one to nature. His family, like many, was drawn to California and all its wonders. First vacationing in 3 successive years. Here is Mother Maud in Avalon on Catalina Island. And I have to say there's nothing about this picture that I don't like. And then selling the Nebraska businesses, moving out and betting the store on the eucalyptus lumber business. Now, this was the 3rd pulse of a eucalyptus speculation boom, and it ended just as the first 2 had, with the small investors taking a beating. His family lost everything. Ralph was just graduating from high school at the moment of financial disaster, so instead of attending Nebraska University as planned, and with very little money, he enrolled in the more affordable Pomona College. Serendipitously, this was just as James Blaisdell became its president. And as this crowd will know, Blaisdell was responsible for introducing the Oxford system of an intertwined yet separate colleges to Pomona, which was an approach unique in America at that time. Blaisdell would turn to Cornell to design the setting for his vision of the college. First, small items while Cornell was an undergraduate, and then at a grand scale later. Cornell would also meet Professor Charles Fuller Baker, a botanist who greatly shaped Cornell's future. He set Ralph up with a succession of assignments and internships, which firmed up his devotion to horticulture and his conviction that what he wanted to do was to design landscapes. This is a page from Cornell's herbarium, which had over 900 specimens by the time he left Pomona. With Baker's introductions, Cornell was able to spend several summers in the Imperial and Coachella valleys, albeit in 115-degree heat, working first on a survey of potential agriculture there, and then with the first serious date plantation owners, the Pompanos, on propagation and infrastructure for this new lucrative crop. Baker was an early proponent of the economic botany paradigm, and Cornell wrote many articles for his journal of economic botany. Cornell referred to these adventures as his desert safari years, and this was the beginning of his lifelong love of the desert. Baker also introduced Cornell to the most extraordinary plantsmen working in California, like here, Francesco Franceschi, who introduced a multitude of Mediterranean plants to California and was responsible for most of the tree planting in Santa Barbara. He met Hugh Evans, he met E.O. Orpit. Baker arranged for him to meet the influential Los Angeles Park Commissioner, Judge Silent, and the park superintendent, Frank Shearer, who was laying out the beginnings of Griffith Park. All these major pioneers of the nascent horticultural milieu of Southern California would recognize the great potential of this young man and would begin, even before he was done with his undergraduate studies, with commissions and responsibilities of significant size. For instance, Cornell designed all the landscape for the new Tony neighborhood of Fremont Place before graduating from Pomona. This was the period of acclimatizing associations, where these amazing horticulturists that Ralph was meeting were filling Southern California with a multitude of plants from all points around the globe and corresponding with their peers from around the world about the results of their introductions. It was a remarkably cosmopolitan moment. Within a couple of years, Franceschi would go to Tunis to lead Italy's horticultural program there. And Professor Baker would go to the Philippines to do the same for the US program there. This pictures of Franceschi's pivotal nursery list of introduced plants. Here's a snapshot of one of Cornell's visits to Franceschi in his growing grounds in Santa Barbara. And the outfit's fantastic. I think we should all garden tam o' shanters. Here, Franceschi is accompanied by this guy, Theodore Payne, who almost single-handedly resuscitated the rapidly disappearing California native floral array. California natives were of great interest to this group. Theodore Payne would play a big part in Ralph's career. Cornell struggled to get through his studies, constantly strapped for cash. He had to take a year off, and in an inspiring story, with what he had learned in the date industry, he invested in 1,200 cuttings of a new imported crop, the alligator pear, and was able to yield enough money to go off to graduate school. So he essentially started the avocado industry in California and got himself into Harvard, which was then the preeminent institution for landscape architecture at the time. This is the Bible of the profession of that moment. Henry Vincent Hubbard here was one of Cornell's primary teachers. There was a strong emphasis on the Beaux-Arts and its somewhat formulaic ways of presenting divisions in the landscape. The chief luminaries of this program came from the office of the Olmsted brothers, the sons of Frederick Law Olmsted of Central Park, who were the most important landscape firm in the country. Cornell excelled in this environment, winning the top prizes in the design competitions, getting a full tuition ride, and graduating summa cum laude. The lessons he learned stayed with him his whole career. He did, however, begin at this point to have some apprehensions about the strict rules associated with the Beaux-Arts. He famously turned down an offer from Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. to work in his firm in Boston, and instead took a position at a firm in Toronto. This was considered a very brave move. And speaking of bravery, even though Ralph was living in Canada and was exempted from service, he chose to come back to the United States to enlist in the Army in the early stages of the US involvement in World War I. Even in the traumatic and trying rigors of war, in which he saw constant action, he was always looking for the horticultural beauty around him, and even went so far as to document different wildflowers he saw, collected the seeds, and had them shipped back to his friend Theodore Payne. Out of the Army, he chose to go back home to California, and on a brief escape, as he termed it, he went to the Sierras, took pictures, which gave him such a charge that he spent the rest of his life devotedly developing his native talent for photography. This would play a very large part in both his design process and in the contributions he would make to the general landscape architectural world of the 20th century. This picture of Yosemite Valley in 1919. He returned to Los Angeles in 1919 and opened almost immediately what many consider to be the first actual landscape architecture office in California. He enlisted the great horticulturalist and California native plant specialist Theodore Payne as his partner. Within a month, he had been hired by James Blaisdell, Pomona College, to create a master plan for his alma mater. Blaisdell famously wanted a college and a garden, and he thought of this, that dollar for dollar, the Marston Quad was the best investment the college ever made. In other comments about his enthusiasm for the dedication to landscape, he said, "Beauty and surrounding is an invaluable factor in education, for it is absorbed unconsciously by the receptive student and makes up the very fiber of his character. It is the indefinable something he will carry with him through life." It's a very fine first commission. Here's their calling card. The partners soon developed a reputation for very sophisticated park design. Many of the parks in Pasadena and nascent developments around the LA Basin, and some very unique projects further afield. They were a brilliant pair with complementary talents. A bit more about Payne. He was a young English gardener who was dazzled by a collection of California plants he saw on display at Kew Gardens, and decided in 1890, the year of Ralph Cornell's birth, to head out to the American West Coast from England to try his luck. 2 days after arriving in Los Angeles, he ran into a horticulturalist in downtown LA who recommended him to perhaps the most forward-thinking horticultural assembly in California, the circle around Madame Modjeska in the Santa Ana Canyon above Anaheim in what would be Orange County. He was working there within a week. Modjeska and her circle had come from Central Europe to found a forward-thinking cultural collective where the best theoretical ideas on agricultural practice were to be, in that heated moment of the late 19th century, were to be put into practice. She was a former opera star, and she had Stanford White, no less, design her home in Santiago Canyon and hosted a salon of like-minded immigrants. Curiously, Florence Yock, the significant and important landscape architect of the 20s and 30s, her father and family were part of that circle. Into this environment, Theodore Payne dropped and became her head gardener. He dove straight into finding out as much as he could about the native landscape that he found himself in the midst of, and shared his newfound knowledge with this ready audience, which had repaired here. He was, for instance, the first horticulturalist who figured out that many of the California native plants require their seed to be heated to a particular temperature before they could germinate, a byproduct of the fire-reliant Mediterranean landscape of Southern California. He went on to become one of the great seed purveyors in the country, gathering up to 1,500 pounds of seed in season to be distributed through the world. He is also a pioneer in the field of transporting large trees, a practice which contributed greatly to the instant gardens that popped up all over the region. But what he is most well known for was his great attention to the native flower fields of California, whose seeds he gathered and propagated and sent all over the world. You probably heard his name as part of the Theodore Payne Foundation, a still vital growing ground of the California native landscape, which you can visit over in Sun Valley. Cornell called Payne the best horticulturalist he had ever met, and he had met some very fine horticulturalists. They made some extraordinary landscapes together. This Central Park in Pasadena, the Washington Park in Pasadena. They had a hand on all of the parks in the system in the early 20s. Here, a historic photograph from 1928 that Cornell himself took of Washington Park from his archives at UCLA. But the one that really should get our attention, the first piece of landscape architecture of broad significance that Cornell was the author of, is this, the Torrey Pines Preserve in San Diego County. Ellen Scripps of Scripps Institute fame, that family, owned a giant parcel in the northern end of the city of San Diego, a remnant piece of the Rancho lands, which was home to an extraordinary population of extremely rare pine trees, the Torrey Pines. They're only found here and in these 2 miles and on a plot on Santa Rosa Island in the Channel Islands, 180 miles away. This extremely sculptural tree was recognized by Scripps as being the anchor of a natural environment worthy of protection. Again, in another Pomona connection, George Marston, for whom the Marston Quad was named, recommended Cornell to Scripps to write a study of what the appropriate approach would be for creating a large municipal park out of this extraordinary asset. Marston had been instrumental in acquiring the first 360 acres of the park 20 years before, to which Scripps would be adding her much larger holdings. The city of San Diego was expanding and pushing into this relatively untouched land. Roadways needed to be built, subdivisions were threatening. An extensive recreational park with a regional botanic garden had been proposed. Cornell and Payne elected to amplify the natural characteristics of this place and write into the report directives which left as much of the territory untouched as possible, and which, when interventions were made, such as trails, roads, and supporting buildings, they were inserted very carefully so as not to disturb the delicate balance these trees lived in. While a road was necessary, they argued for an alternate road to be placed inland to relieve the park of the larger load of cars that was inevitably coming, which of course would end up being I-5, so that was a large load of cars coming. About this, Cornell stated, "The impression that stands out above all others is the distinctiveness of this one spot. Torrey Pines is not a place of typical scenery. It is not representative of the primitive natural landscape of San Diego County or of any other place in the world. It is itself alone and inimitable." Upon her death, Scripps deeded her land in perpetuity to the Torrey Pines Preserve with the caveat that it must be maintained to Ralph Cornell's specifications. Cornell would revisit those recommendations in 1931 and again in 1949, so it was a lifelong endeavor. Cornell's approach to Torrey Pines is of broad significance. It's the first park of its kind wherein the distinct natural features of this place in their natural state are protected, and where interventions need to occur, they were executed in the most sensitive way to the landscape that's featured. It's his first true dry ground park. Curiously, the partnership dissolved after Torrey Pines. It always seemed an anomaly to me. This was perhaps the best pair of individuals to practice together in this new wide open world of a rapidly developing California. And Cornell and Payne remained close friends for the rest of their long lives. Yet after 5 years, Cornell moved into another partnership with an established landscape developing firm called Cook and Hall, who drew a lot of subdivision maps and provided trio layouts and semi-public spaces for these nascent neighborhoods. It was certainly very good work. They were perhaps most famous for their work on the then new city of Beverly Hills, where they laid out the first curving street subdivision in Southern California, built a few small parks, and developed the now iconic street pattern of the city to be much emulated. Obviously, this work was very different than the very advanced dry garden parks that Cornell had just successfully completed. So why go this way? Cook and Hall were a half generation older than Cornell. Wilbur Cook had been the principal designer of much of the iconic landscape in Beverly Hills and was instrumental in developing the profession of landscape architecture in California. He had been associated with the Olmsted firm in the early 20th century and was an early ASLA member. The 1920s was the decade where a real push was coming out of Harvard and the Olmsted firm to establish landscape architecture as a regulated profession, as architects had already done. Cornell was very invested in being part of this effort. So it ends up that is what broke up Cornell and Payne. I found a letter in Cornell's archives at UCLA from Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. to Cook, dated 9/21. There's no doubt that Theodore Payne would be ineligible for membership in the ASLA. He asked Cook to caution Cornell to avoid the personal embarrassment of a professional association with a nurseryman. He also insinuated that such an association might preclude Cornell from becoming an ASLA member. He says you have to draw the line somewhere. So that ideal partnership, which today would be seen as brilliantly symbiotic, was thwarted by an emerging rather narrow view from the East Coast of what constituted an as yet undefined profession, certainly not plantsmen. There's a long-running critique of the profession that holds that landscape architects care too little for plants and much more for the trappings of their associated field architecture. Slide rule envy was the joke. I think the de-emphasizing of horticulture comes from this historic push towards professionalism. Immediately after Cornell and Payne was dissolved, Cornell was admitted into the ASLA. He joined as a junior partner with Cook and Hall and was immediately in another world. These are the iconic neighborhoods in Beverly Hills today. It was a very successful tree planting and created a place in an extraordinary way. This is it in 1923, as Cornell was just joining the firm. It was a kind of design that featured a lot of water. And by virtue of its location, it was soon to be the backdrop for a burgeoning film industry in Southern California. Here's Chaplin in Sunset Park across from Beverly Hills Hotel. It puts Ralph right in the middle of one of the most important amplifications of a design aesthetic that had happened in American history. 80% of American households at this time went to the movies every weekend. These iconic landscapes of the Los Angeles region, which Cook, Hall, and Cornell were designing many of, are visible in almost every movie shot outside. The whole world had an image of what California was like from this massive exposure. Cornell vigorously jumped into this new world of possibilities. There was an abundance of work, and with quite a lot of variety. Being the designer he was, he quickly improved the quality of work of his new firm and would soon become its principal designer. In that vein, here's a fascinating little project from his archive showing a stage set garden for Fox Studios, which was designed to be able to be changed with ease to suit different criteria for different movies. Here it is in its Italian mode. Here's the plan. And here it is in its French mode. In this robust economy of the 20s, he was able to design many different projects, which ranged from civic and institutional to some extraordinary residential commissions. Here are a few images of an exceptional residential design he did with the noted architect Sumner Spalding. These are Cornell's own photos from his archives. His photographer's eye had a significant influence on his design. He was constantly checking compositions with the aid of these beautifully framed views. It was in this period that Cornell designed the second of his three cultural landmark landscapes. Wilbur Cook laid out Beverly Hills in the elements like this Sunset Park in the teens, and the opportunity arose to significantly add to Cook's plan in the mid-1920s. Cornell and his firm were commissioned to design a 1.5 mile long park that stretched along Santa Monica Boulevard all the way across the breadth of the city. Called Beverly Park, it's a rich and varied plan which started from a very generous idea of how this young city could develop. As opposed to creating a commercial corridor for which these lots were zoned, the city raised money through a bond measure to buy and commit to parkland the entire length of the major artery through town. The park features some remarkable fountains, including this one at the corner of Wilshire and Santa Monica Boulevard. As Cornell often liked to do, the fountain itself was designed by someone he admired and wanted to include in the project, in this case, Frank Fwelling. This fountain, with its ever-changing lights, a new technological feature, became a tourist destination for the newly mobile auto population of Los Angeles. The park is characterized by its beautiful orchestration of light and shadow, of ornamental plantings, of the water features and the pergolas, and of the beautiful seating and lawn areas. These exquisite large presentation drawings are also from his archive and show the tremendous attention to detail that Cornell brought to this very visible project. This is kind of the beginning of outdoor lighting in general for gardens, and this would have been quite a sight. Here are some more of those amazing presentation drawings. They go the length of the entire project, and every other block has these wonderful little renderings to let the population know what they're getting in each place. Here's an early photo of the project. The park was designed to be enjoyed from the cars and the streetcars that ran parallel to it, and of course, there's a pedestrian promenade. And the way it looks today. A simple pair of blocks, a little close up here, with these careful little features characterizing each individual garden. This project catapulted the already well-known landscape architect into another level, a beautiful example of his early and mature work. He had continued all the while at Pomona, and in the late 20s, he took a page from Blaisdell's own book and the way he proceeded with its master planning. In the spirit of the Oxford Plan of Affiliated College, Cornell elected to recommend that one of the new colleges to be built should have a different landscape architect to give it its own character. It's a very generous act for any designer to cede control and hope that an alternative view might still be harmonious. He knew what he was doing, of course. He enlisted Edward Huntsman Trout, a respected colleague and a good friend of his, and entrusted him with the design of the Scripps College grounds. Scripps, in my opinion, is the best designed American campus of a decade in which many beautiful American campuses were designed. In the context of this lecture, what I find interesting is how beautifully symbiotic the landscape of Scripps is within Cornell's overall plan. There are wonderful alignments and almost a call and response quality to the way the very organized Huntsman Trout plan fits within the larger scaled Cornell gestures. I believe both are better for the way they interact visually, truly to Blaisdell's point. A college in a garden. Some shots that I love. I must be the school cat. But in the domestic scale of Huntsman Trout against the grand scale of Cornell, I think it's really quite fascinating. Cornell was constantly looking towards where the profession was going, perhaps as a reaction against the strict Beaux-Arts tutelage of his Harvard years. This little project in Palm Springs is a good example. This would have been a very small project to take for an office of this importance. But remember, Cornell adored the desert and constantly returned to it for inspiration. He would have been delighted to have an excuse to go out and see his beloved Coachella Valley. And he created a fascinating small garden in the midst of this dry landscape. But it wasn't just the interesting planting and the innovative way in which the garden sits in the native landscape. Cornell in this plan from 1927 was obviously aware of some of the design iconography that had come out of the 1925 Paris Decorative Arts Fair. The composition of walls and paths and the distribution of planting looks forward to a generation that would utilize these movements of decorative arts as design DNA for their landscapes. And Cornell's garden was completed fully 4 years before this famous garden, Naumkeag by Fletcher Steele, which is often cited as one of the first modern gardens in America, again, deriving its language from the 1925 Paris Fair. This is the image I think they both saw, an André Vera design for a small park in Paris published in 1926. Cook, Hall, and Cornell were hired for many institutional projects, both in Southern California and beyond, such as this, the master plan for the University of Hawaii. Cornell's excitement about what he was seeing when he was engaged to do this work is palpable. Ever the plantsman, he reveled in the possibilities of these exotic places. Not a bad job either. Another project of note is this, the restoration of Rancho Los Cerritos. Cook, Hall, and Cornell had been approached about drawing up a subdivision for the Bixby family, which still held great tracts of rancho land that they had had since the 1850s. At the same time, the family wanted to revivify the old rancho building at the heart of the land. This part of the project fell to Cornell. This is some historic photos of the adobe, and note the way the forecourt works and the entrance for the carriages. So this is the plan, which is really a complete reimagining of the rancho, setting it into a garden as opposed to the somewhat bleak environs that it had historically been surrounded by. It yielded a magical garden, which evokes a past which maybe didn't exist, but which is so successful but the period of significance is now considered to be the Cornell Garden. There was a general romanticization of the Rancho period at this time, but this is a particularly dreamy essay of that moment. It's a gorgeous project. The court, which would have had carriages running around it and the accompanying horses, reimagined as a kind of beautiful reflecting pond. And then looking back to that gate that the carriages used to come in. The ancient trees planted when the house was built. All went great until the Depression really hit. Cook and Hall both left the firm to join the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, as work had entirely dried up. Cornell soldiered on and never closed the office, but in increasingly difficult circumstances. He tried many things. Here's some plans he did. One could buy for a quarter from Ladies' Home Journal to build your own garden on a typical lot. Plans, plant lists, philosophy, all for 25 cents. I found about 20 of these in his archives. He took the opportunity to popularize his vision of the California landscape by hosting a radio show. It was called the Chaparral Club Radio Show. And he took very small commissions and poured his all into them. This a tiny garden would have been a corner of the work that he was doing 5 years before, but very beautifully done. He's trying a lot of hand coloring, hand tinting of photographs at this point too. This is one of them. All the while experimenting with photography. He put together this book in the depths of the 30s, a celebration of the California native flora. He commissioned these beautiful linocuts and took all the photos. Here, his beloved Torrey Pine. And while his work at Pomona would continue to the end of the decade, it was with great relief to him that the regents of the UC system, impressed with his Pomona campus, chose him to be the campus landscape architect for the new UCLA campus in Westwood, a position he would hold for the rest of his life. Here, an early postcard of UCLA with a pair of biplanes in the lower left corner, which really kind of excites me. I wonder what that was. This project involves some very significant reimagining of the topography. Cornell was a very active participant in the development of the campus, stating repeatedly that everything from the drip line of the buildings out was the landscape architect's domain. The core of the campus holds very true to Cornell's vision. That whole entire center axis, which goes through the Royce Hall and Powell Library down to the Great Lawn, is almost exactly as drawn, including the filling in of that arroyo to create the quads around music and architecture. While some things have not survived, what has endured is this remarkable artistry of tree planting that unifies the campus. I live hard by UCLA and attended graduate school there. I ride my bike to the campus almost daily. I am still learning from the ways that Cornell utilized all the palette of landscape to knit all these disparate buildings of the campus together. The depth of experience that he had from his tenure at Pomona gave him an absolutely unique ability to foresee the ramifications of these trees that he would plant, and it shows. I mean, consider that he was starting work in Pomona at age 20, and this project's coming in when he's about 50. So he's already seen 30 years of growth at his alma mater. Quite an amazing thing. A very heavily Cornell corner. I'm happy to report that UCLA to this day follows the playbook that Cornell came up with, which really helps keep the campus cohesive. The Second World War was a time of public service. He was doing a lot of grading plans for the military, almost no landscape architecture, but immediately thereafter, Cornell's work took another step into the future. Southern California was booming and his work expanded to meet the need. There were a vast number of new parks, which he was decidedly well suited to design here in Redondo Beach. This is a design for Hancock Park, the site of LACMA and the Brea Tar Pits Museum right now being built over by the Zumthor building for LACMA. He did residential gardens as a kind of experimental form, but his major work was at the institutional scale, these giant parks for these new suburban communities. He developed a comprehensive plan for Griffith Park, on which he had worked with Frank Shearer 30 years earlier, and brought a lot of his dry park thoughts to this park as well. He worked on Elysian Park as well. He did this kind of fascinating project where he teamed up with his old friend Edward Huntsman Trout of Scripps College fame to design the grounds of Ambassador College. I had never seen these renderings before I went through his archives. They're quite extraordinary. I'm just showing you a bunch of images right now. These are things I had never seen or heard about, which are in his archives. And I should thank the archives librarians for letting me photograph some of these when I was preparing for the Cultural Landscape Foundation's celebration of Cornell. Just all delighted to see these things. Here's a plan for Santa Monica College that he did, for Visalia Junior College. He designed a lot of significant cemeteries. And what's fascinating about these for an architectural historian is you get to see the trees achieve their full growth and composition. There's not a lot of redevelopment going on, obviously. This of the Glen Haven Memorial Park, which is really quite a beautiful piece. Very detailed work he did for this. He also designed this iconic cemetery, Hillside Memorial Park, with its famous freeway close monument to Al Jolson, designed by Paul Williams. Or so I thought until going through the archives. Here's Cornell's schematic design for the water stair from 4 years prior. So it ends up that Paul Williams really just designed the little cupola at the top. He was never one to pass up a chance to work in the desert. Here's a kind of great park he did out in Palm Springs, the North End Park with the Williams. And he loved a big ag show. He loved working on these. This is the National Orange Show, which he did quite a lot of work on different years. Here's a particularly nice one with Harwell Hamilton Harris. He's experimenting with new ways of designing. And here by 1949, he's again looking forward to the emerging vocabulary available to landscape architects, coming up with some very modern feeling designs. This is a time of real semantic change for landscape architecture, and California was right in the middle of it. You remember his Cree house out in the desert from 27. Now that approach would be taken to the next level by the younger practitioners, as shown here with this Ralph Royston drawing, and here with this Tommy Church scheme. Cornell took on a couple of partners to start the 50s, Howard Troller out of Berkeley being the primary new designer. The work certainly changed, some of it not as successful as here in the LA Plaza project downtown, which is sort of a windswept, not terribly pleasant place to be, but still iconic. He was the landscape architect for the music center for the entire tableau there. There were these giant park projects, but still fascinating small house projects. Here are some sketches I found in the archives in Cornell's own hand, working in this new vein. Really quite fascinating, very, very nimble designer. But he had one more landscape, true cultural significance up his sleeve, one that really showed off his great talent for unifying space and creating a whole new spirit of place out of what was essentially nothing. The Franklin D. Murphy Sculpture Garden had its beginnings out of an awkward space between a gaggle of disparate 1950s modernist buildings at the northeast corner of the UCLA campus. The area had been a parking lot until the chancellor decided that it should become a sculpture garden to anchor the arts and theater departments that had recently been expanded. What Cornell came up with is perhaps one of the finest modernist gardens we have on the West Coast. A tour de force of site modifications, tree placement, site furniture, and textural richness that completely transports the visitor away from the oddly leftover architectural void to a garden of great intellectual rigor and sophistication. Cornell and his associates deployed a wealth of visual tricks, an implied bridge you see in the foreground to visually unmoor the garden from its surroundings, a subtle valley and hill to create depth and a kind of blurred sense of distance, sculptural seating to enhance the sense of ambiguous scale, and an astonishingly effective use of trees to both create a sense of openness in the center and to utterly diminish the really uninspired architecture which surrounds the space. Carefully choreographed paving organizes distinctive areas of the ground plane, providing multiple identities to the different buildings which the garden communicates. Here we see the end of the triple alley of coral trees that Cornell set up in front of the theater and art building. Again, Cornell reached out to an artist he admired to design important elements of this garden. In this case, the sculptor Malcolm Leyland designed the distinctive bench pods. It's a view right after completion. There are many different pavings in this space, which instead of being cacophonous, only increase the textural richness and the illusion of greater size. At each corner, there's a distinctive orthogonal element which anchors this exuberant space back into the general campus. Looking at the theater building across the fountain at the northeast, and then across the great open hill and valley in the center. The benches, the garden walls, everything is done with a great attention to overall effect, a kind of floating quality. And the trees that were planted, Cornell knew the ultimate look of what the quad would be, even though it would be decades before the composition was complete. So sort of see here how the combination of the perimeter of conifers and the artful placement of the deciduous jacarandas in the center creates a space where the buildings almost dematerialize. This is further accentuated by the subtle shifts in grade, the positive and negative of the shallow valley on the left and the low hillock on the right. Here's a quote from Ralph that I found in his oral history tapes talking about this project. Your planting is not just putting in flowers and interesting things. It is trying to set off the architecture, augment it, help it where it needs it, and supplement the form and accent which it attempts or achieves. In regard to the North Campus here, 5 architects, 5 buildings, and then you keep saying that the landscape will pull it all together. Well, it may do so. I think it does because it forms a cohesive treatment which creates views and vistas and screens out of defects and gives spaciousness. So your landscape design is just as functional. It's just as important as anything else. Here's that triple alley of coral trees. And then just a general view. Beyond the vast number of projects Cornell completed in his life, he also contributed to 3 of the most influential books about California gardens of his lifetime. The first was California Gardens by Winifred Starr Dobbins from 1932, which was the first compendium of the California design style, which by that time, after the 20s, the boom of the 20s, had a distinctive quality, which was recognized really around the world as being something new. His photos and projects are well represented in this book, and he photographed for some of his friends as well. The second one was this, perhaps the best book on the history of Southern California, Victoria Padilla's book on Southern California Gardens from 1962. In addition to being one of Padilla's friends and speaking with her quite a bit during the making of this book, he contributed both plant portraits and portraits of his many beloved cohort of horticulturalists that he had known his whole life. Here's a picture of Theodore Payne on his 82nd birthday, and here's a picture of E.O. Orpit, and here's a picture of Hugh Evans, the great nurseryman who Cornell had worked with 30 years before in the making of Beverly Park. He also contributed all the photography to his great friend Mildred Mathias's Flowered Plants in the Landscape. And this was the pivotal book, really, in establishing the relevance of the Mediterranean palette for gardeners in Southern California. As a photographer, he was eager to embrace new aesthetic languages and technologies, just as he was as a landscape architect. These color photographs that he did for Mathias are really a whole new world for him, and he really nails it, hits it with aplomb. So to contextualize Cornell's career, Just think about this. When he and his family come to California on vacations in the teens, the population of the state is 1.5 million. When he came back from World War I, the population was 3.5 million. When he designs the Franklin D. Murphy Sculpture Garden that we just looked at, the population in California is 16 million. At his death in 1972, the population is 21 million. This was an astounding time to live in this state. Cornell was a designer of the first order. He was open to new ideas. He was a superb plantsman. He was an inspiring figure for both his clients and those that worked for him. But he was also extremely lucky to be at the right place at the right time. To be in Pomona when Dr. Blaisdell was just beginning his astonishing expansion of the Claremont colleges. To have so much faith bestowed upon him at such an early age that he was entrusted to design that great campus. To meet all those pivotal figures of California horticulture in the early 20th century, to find his path early and ride the wave of this 14-fold expansion of population over the length of his career. That provided him enviable opportunities. But his genius is that he kept growing and met those opportunities with enthusiasm and great intellectual curiosity. But what of the 22-year-old that proposed a dry garden park? Clearly, this is something different. So what happened? I think in many ways, this is the factor that separates the dry garden aspirations of the young man from the realities of the career. When water came to Southern California, first from the Owens Valley, that first water coming in from the Owens Valley to the San Fernando Valley, and then from the peripheral canal, the game changed for the nascent profession of landscape architecture. While Cornell always advocated for the dry native Californian garden, he recognized the need for the profession to be useful. Available water fed the dreamlike quality already here. One thing I stress in the history class I teach at USC is the concept of anachronistic fallacy, that we cannot judge the past by the standards of today. Cornell designed many landscapes which we would not consider to be water-wise. But that was mostly within the context of a California that looked to have a secure and almost infinite supply of water. His dry garden thinking was so prescient 109 years ago, we wonder why didn't he just press forward on that path? I often wonder in my study of his career, if he had been able to continue with Theodore Payne, would there have been an entirely different paradigm for landscape development in this Mediterranean climate we have? If the plantsman had been led into the ASLA, would there have been a more nuanced development of the profession? It's idle speculation, of course. But what a compelling life he had, and how effective he was in introducing wherever he could his beloved dry garden. So that's my talk on Ralph Cornell.
Wow. Thank you, Brian. That was amazing. It was interesting because I saw so many parallels with what has happened here in Claremont, including the California Botanic Garden, which there is a connection to Claremont. I can talk about that a little bit, but we had a couple of questions, and I'll just kind of moderate them. If you would like to ask a question, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and write it in, and I will convey it to Brian. So the first question we had was, someone mentioned that they know a Cree house in Palm Springs, designed by Albert Frey. And I don't know if Cornell actually designed the Betty K. Cree studio and house in 1930, but the participant was wondering if he had designed houses with the name of Cree, or but I think I can explain that one. So So the one that you were talking about was the 1930 Betty K. Cree studio. I think she was an artist.
Mhm.
And so I don't think he designed the house. He did the landscape.
Just the landscape. Yeah,
Yeah, right.
just the landscape.
And the Albert Frey Cree house, many of you know that Albert Frey was a former student of Le Corbusier, and came to Palm Springs in the 1930s. That house, which exists, was named for Raymond Cree, former school superintendent turned real estate developer, and that house was built in 1955. It's been on a number of tours. I actually had an opportunity to go there and interview the owner, the current owner of it, for a documentary called Desert Utopia, which you can find on the Claremont Heritage website, which is the history of Palm Springs modern architecture. So that, I think, would answer that question. So there were two Cree houses in Palm Springs. We had another question. Did Cornell work on the La Quinta resort? Do you know?
No, he didn't, but Reginald Johnson did.
Okay.
And that was what a wonderful project that was. And it actually was started when it was Johnson, Kaufman, and Coate. So they were the ones that laid that out. Extraordinary piece of work in its initial guise.
Another question was, what does SLA stand for?
The American Society of Landscape Architects.
Okay, so it's ASLA.
ASLA.
Okay, perfect. I wanted to just mention a couple of things that kind of, came to the forefront of my mind in your talk, which was fascinating. And thank you so much, Ryan, for this. But I know you mentioned Sumner Spalding, and I don't know if many Clermonters know, but Sumner Spalding designed the Village Theater in Claremont here, which is now Harvard Square and the Bardot restaurant. Another thing that kind of came to mind was, we have the California Botanic Garden here in Claremont, and there were some connections there with Ralph Cornell. Susanna Bixby Bryant actually created this 200-acre site in Santa Ana Canyon. It was her ranch near Yorba Linda. And I guess she actually knew Theodore Payne, who was Cornell's first partner, I guess. And he collected seeds for her and helped transport them to the new Botanic Garden, and actively was engaged in the directing some of the plantings here in Claremont and the Indian Hill Mesa. All this was because of actually, I don't know if he was involved with the one here or the one in Santa Ana, but there was a 1943 fire in Santa Ana, actually fueled by the Santa Ana winds, and then followed by a winter of torrential rains causing landslides and such. And the garden was basically devastated. So Mrs. Bixby Bryant was on the board of the trustees of Pomona College and asked a Pomona botany professor, Philip Moons, to be her garden botanist. And it was Dr. Moons, after Mrs. Bixby Bryant's passing, who kind of took over the garden, arranged to relocate it to Claremont in 1951. So that's, it's like there's just kind of this history that, just is so fascinating. And I also believe that Ralph Cornell designed our local cemetery here, Oak Park Cemetery.
He did, yeah. There's drawings of it at UCLA.
So, so he was kind of everywhere. Do we have, are there any other questions for Brian? Okay, here we go. Question, were the palm trees in this Palm Springs residential garden ornamentally topped to look like mushrooms?
I think they were actually a Palapas idea.
Oh, they were topped. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Or they were very dead and they didn't get there before so that they could get the pictures.
This is coming from a graduate of the landscape architecture program at Cal Poly, so there might have
No,
been
they were Palapas. You can tell in some other photographs in the archives.
there might have been a little bit of tongue in cheek there. Another question, could you tell the source of Cornell's quote you read when talking about and showing the plan of Pomona's campus? It was about the importance of landscape to the quality of life and character of those who experienced it.
That is a quote that that it came from Blaisdell, and I don't remember the source off the top of my head, but it was a pamphlet that I found in Ralph Cornell's archives, where he had been quoted saying that, and apparently Ralph had said "nice" or something like that on the little booklet. So. That was where that came from.
Okay, great. Any other questions out there? Please go to the Q&A button at the bottom and okay, here we go. We have some more coming in. There's actually so many people thanking you for this presentation. And I should mention that it will be available online on Claremont Heritage's YouTube channel within probably, at least 12 to 16 hours. We are recording it. And so that'll be available. Someone else is asking, do you have an email address you can share for future lectures in San Marino, Pasadena? And I'm happy to share your contact information if you're okay with that.
Sure. That's fine.
Okay. And what is your, I'll just type it, I'll type it in here. So tell me your email again. I should have it memorized. We've communicated so much, but
It's Brian at tichenorandthorpe.com.
BRIAN at Tichenor, TICHENOR, and Thorpe, THORP.com.
That's right.
Okay. Excellent. Any other questions? And that information we'll put that on the YouTube presentation as well, so that people can reach out to you. Yeah, I just want to, with no more questions coming, Brian, I just really want to thank you for an inspiring and educational and just incredible insight into someone who really had a major impact on Claremont as a city, Pomona College as a college, and our region here in Southern California. It was fascinating, and just want to thank you for it, and encourage people to get involved with Claremont Heritage, because this is the kind of programming that we like to bring to you, and make it accessible so you can learn. And we have a lot of archives. I know Ralph was involved in some of the street tree decisions in Claremont in the 70s. We have some of the plans in our archives. And so, this kind of history is really relevant to today, I think, because of, what's going on with the drought and, all this, things that are happening, global warming, all that. And to look back and see really what the intention was, and what our early founders were concerned with and wanted to convey in terms of our community. So thank you again. And I think that's it. No more questions. So everybody, please go to CleremontHeritage.org and you can see a link to the YouTube presentation, and feel free to sign up as a member, volunteer. We need your help, especially during this time. And thank you for joining us this evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everybody have a great night. Take care.